You have three kingdoms, the early kingdom, early Egypt, the middle kingdom, and then the late. Between these were intermediate periods. First intermediate, and then finally last intermediate. The intermediate period were periods of chaos. The early period, an Egyptian pharaoh built a canal that joined the Red Sea to the Nile, and later Egyptian pharaohs were not even rich enough or powerful to keep it open. Now part of this canal still exists, but it's silted up, greatly filled up with sand. The desert winds have filled up. The earlier pharaohs could build it, the later pharaohs could keep it open. Pyramids. All right. You may have heard that the pyramids were burial grounds. I can't disprove it, but in the Great Pyramid, at least, there never was a body found in it. Why were they constructed? There have been all kinds of theories, some of them fairly wild.
For the treasure, right?
What's that?
For their treasure, right? Their gold and all that.
No treasure was ever found inside them. No bodies were found either. But it would be a place to store the treasure. Now, there have been stories that if you build something the shape of the Great Pyramid and store your razor blade, I've never tried it, your razor blade will never grow dull. Will always remain sharp. Somebody put a dead cat inside a pyramid shape one time, and the cat did not decay. I mean, folks, you can take that for whatever it's worth. These stories have been told. Why? First of all, it is believed by many experts that we today could not build the Great Pyramid if we wanted to. We don't have the machinery, we don't have the technology. How did they build it? It's known that some of the rocks that are used in the pyramid were quarried from 600 miles away. How did they move the rocks? They rolled them on logs. I've got to remind you something. There are no, and have never been in 10,000 years, there are no forests in Egypt. Yes?
Aren't they also like aligned with Orion's belt?
Oh, the pyramid is aligned with some of the stars, yes. Oh, yes. And also it has some really complex mathematics involved. Have any of you ever heard of a number called the golden section? It's involved in one side of the pyramid. The golden section.
It's a shaft, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it actually, the ratio of the height to one of its sides is 1.618034. And again, I don't have time to explain, but that is a highly significant number. But also the ratio of the base of the pyramid to its height, the ratio of that is half of pi, carried out to the fourth decimal place. What's the big deal? Pi was not carried out by Europeans to the fourth decimal place till the 1600s. But they knew it. They aligned it up with at least the star Orion, and pointed at what may have been the North. Now, what today is the North Star was not always the North Star. Today, the North Star is Polaris. But there was another star that they used as a North Star at one time. But what I was getting at was they quarried the stone 600 miles away, and folks, there's no evidence of a trail that they took to get the pyramid, to get the stones to the site. And furthermore, they could not have floated them down the Nile. Again, a lack of logs for one thing. They couldn't build a raft that big. But for another, the Nile River, like all rivers in Africa, except for the Congo, they'll go along for a while, then drop off in a waterfall. This waterfall is known as a cataract. Cataract. Then it'll go off for a while and then form another cataract. Again, because the continent of Africa is in layers. There's this layer here, then it'll go on for a while, all of a sudden it'll drop off rather suddenly, and level off for a while, then drop off. So the rivers flow along a while, then come to the cataract, drop off several feet and go on. You can't get a 60-ton rock over a cataract easily. The fact of the matter, and some of them I've heard that the rocks were mined so deep that you cannot survive without breathing gear. How did they get the rocks out of this mine, and how did they move them 600 miles to the pyramid site? And it's, the evidence shows the pyramid was all built in 20 years, which meant they had to lay one stone every 2 or 3 seconds. Bang, 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 bang. One right after every 2, and working day and night to finish. There are 2,300,000 stones, enough stones to circle France 2 times. All right. Again, I was asked last fall, do you have a rational explanation for how the pyramid was built? I said, I don't know. Now, there are folks that they melted the rock, carried it in liquid form, and then once they, not melted by heat, but melted by acid. Then once they got it in place, they simply took the acid away, or the acid dried like concrete, and these rocks were really poured. Again, little evidence of that, folk. But that, even that explanation leaves. And though they built a causeway, the causeway would have taken up more material than the pyramid itself. We don't know how they could have lifted those things. Getting a team of men to lift up a 60-ton rock, folk, there's no team of men that can do it. The heave-ho method cannot lift up 60-ton rocks.
And they said there wasn't enough space for that many hands.
What's that?
They tried to do it, but there wouldn't be enough space for their hands.
There wouldn't be enough space for their hands. That's right. Now, teams of men can lift up fairly heavy rocks, 2 to 3 ton.
Elephants.
Elephants. Pulleys. The thing about pulleys, you have to have beams that are strong enough to hold them. Again, what would they have used for the machinery? We've not seen any evidence of such machinery. But now, pulleys. So theoretically, a block and tackle could be made strong enough, in theory. And actually, you still have to explain what kind of roping they would have used. And how would they have found, I mean, the top of the pyramid, the Great Pyramid is 480 feet high. How do you raise it to that level? I mean, to go take up steps as they go. There are problems involved in it, because simply we don't know how they did it. All right. Egypt consists of 2 halves, Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, you might think that Upper Egypt would be north and Lower south, but they had it backwards from us because Upper Egypt was in a higher elevation and Lower Egypt was closer to sea level. And of course, they knew the cataract dropped off. So Upper Egypt was the southern part of Egypt. And Lower Egypt, it's believed that Egypt might have been disunited at one time until finally a king united the land of Egypt into one kingdom. Now, there are similarities between Egypt and China. And again, this little chart that I have indicates that the Chinese, at one point, their ancestry may have lived in Egypt. The writing, cuneiform writing, looks a lot like, Chinese writing looks a lot like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Another thing too, they named the dynasties by number. You know, the Chinese history is based on its dynasties. You have the Han Dynasty, the Shin Dynasty, this dynasty, that dynasty, and the Tang Dynasty. In Egypt, though, they numbered their dynasties. There was a first dynasty, the second dynasty. Now, the word dynasty, very important. You're going to run into it. It means rule by a family. Where that the family kept the throne, generally the kingship passed from father to son. The dynasty would appear for a while and then disappear. The average length of a dynasty was only about 3 generations, father, son, and grandson. Now, there is one exception. The Chinese have had the same ruling family, the emperors, for about 2,400 years. I've been more like 2,600 years. We'll talk more about that when we go to Japan. The Japanese have had the same ruling family for that long. And our present Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, traces her ancestry to a man who lived in the 400s, but he traced his all the way back to Noah. Again, if you can believe the records, the records are there if you can believe them. Anyway, dynasty, ruled by a family. First dynasty united the 2 Egypts into one. Second dynasty followed them. The Great Pyramid was built by the 4th dynasty. And the next pyramid after it was built by his son. They were during the Old Kingdom. Then after the Old Kingdom came a period of chaos. And again, this is similar to Chinese history. They'd have dynasties, then come a period of chaos. Then they'd get a period of stability again. The Middle Kingdom brought about some stability. All right. Then finally the Middle Kingdom gave way to a period of chaos again. Then finally the New Kingdom. Egypt was eventually conquered by its enemies. It was first conquered by Babylon, then later conquered by Alexander the Great, and has spent much of its history being ruled by outside influences. All right. The religion of the Egyptians was very much polytheistic. So I've already mentioned some of their gods. Thoth was one of them. Set was another. Sometimes Set is called Seth. Thoth, Set. But don't worry about their names so much. A lot of persons say that they're the same gods as Sumerians worship, but with different names. But there was one Egyptian king who tried to change that back to monotheism, Akhenaten, and the reason I mentioned it, your book spends 2 whole paragraphs on it. Akhenaten tried to get Egypt back into to get Egypt to monotheism. His attempt failed. His successor undid all of his reforms.
Most of them halfway away from history.
Say it again. Now,
They also try to erase some history, restoring the statues and sculptures.
I'm so glad about I want to get back to that. Yes.
Was he the king with the elongated skull?
The what?
Was he the king with the elongated skull, like the long skull?
I'm not
I
sure.
believe one of the Egyptian pharaohs had an elongated skull.
I'm not sure of that. But now, what you said, something you said that triggers something, changing history. The Egyptian scribes are known to have done all they could to alter and change their history, and they could get away because they did not teach their history like we're teaching it to youngsters. Instead, the knowledge of the Egyptians was all confined to a priestly class, and these priests were looked on as being scientists, scholars, priests, but they were a special caste, and their job was to preserve knowledge, and one of the things they were trying hard to do was make it look like we Egyptians are the oldest civilization on earth, and they altered their history. Now, in what way? It's believed that they sometimes took dynasties that ruled separately, but made them look like they ruled one after another. In our own history, one time our country had 2 presidents. When Abraham Lincoln was president, part of our country lived under Jefferson Davis. Now, what if somebody went back in history and said, oh, Abraham Lincoln was president, and after he was president, Jefferson Davis was president for 4 years. We give Lincoln 4 years, give Jefferson Davis 4 years, you've added 8 years, you've added 4 years to our country's history. But what if we instead also just went through and made every governor of every state a president at one time? We now have 50 states. You could make it, our country look like it was about 4,000 or 5,000 years old. I mean, when I was a kid, there was Governor Rhodes of Ohio, Governor David Lawrence of Pennsylvania. What if you made them be president and put them end to end, one after another? You could add 3,000 or 4,000 years to our country's history. The ancient Egyptians are believed to have done things like that to their records. And that is why it is really difficult to line up Egyptian history with the history of their neighbors. And that's why when you come to the question of, well, and again, when the Bible mentions the ancient pharaohs, they don't name them until you come to about 600 BC, then they start naming them. So when Abraham visited Egypt, it just refers to this king as Pharaoh. Well, who is the Pharaoh when Abraham visited Egypt? Some scholars think they know, but 3 or 4 different scholars have 3 or 4 different pharaohs in mind. Same way with who is the Pharaoh when the Israelis were kicked themselves out of Egypt, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Again, there are about 8 or 9 different opinions on that. You're looking for a Pharaoh who was not followed by his oldest son. Well, it turns out there were several. But it's difficult to line up Egyptian history owing to, and again, the dating of history in the ancient world. What can you give dates? And this, again, this makes ancient history look like a fairy tale. You cannot give absolute dates to anything before 700 BCE. And some people believe that the earth, the calendar was last up when, for instance, during the flood. Other people believe that the calendar was last up because of other astronomical events. And some people believe that Mars and Venus once had a different orbit than they do now, and the Earth would sometimes come too close to Mars and its rotation to be changed. You simply, you run into problems, and there have been scholars who've worked on it for years. The fact is, we do not know any dates absolutely before 700 BC. All the dating of the ancient world is approximate. All right. One of the kings, but I must mention, is actually a queen, Queen Hatshepsut. I did have a student do a paper on her one time. Queen Hatshepsut set herself up. I mean, this happens several times in history, and including in China. The way a queen would sometimes become king was when she'd be the wife of a king. Her husband would die and leave a small child. So the child might be 7 or 8 years old, too young to be king. So they would officially crown the 7-year-old son as the king, but then the mother would take over and rule. And at some point, eventually, the mother would either imprison or kill her son and set herself up as the sole ruler. This happened more than once, but this, particularly Hatshepsut, took over during a time when her, like I say, after her husband died, and her son was too young to rule. And when she died, the next ruler after her did everything he could to erase her memory, and most of what we know about her we found from trash heaps. The Egyptians threw her statues away in trash heaps. And we found out that she appears to have been a very attractive, intelligent woman, but her memory was attempted to be erased, and nevertheless, she's one of the more known about kings in all of ancient history, queens that is in all of ancient history. The more famous king was King Tut. King Tut's body was at one time in Atlanta at the Civic Center. His mummified remains have been carried all over the world. King Tut apparently only lived about 20-some years. Very wealthy king. But as you remember, because the mummy was found. Now, yeah, the Egyptians mummified their dead, preserved them, and a lot of the mummies have since been packed away. You know, it's known the dry desert sand of Egypt will preserve a body for 1,000 years, even without being mummied. The sand will just absorb all the moisture, dry out the body, and preserve it. But especially if they were mummified, they would take out the internal organs, fill in the body with tar, and it would last that way for about 3,000 or 4,000 years.